Well, welcome to the Harvard Art Museums and this evening's program, David Levinthal, History, Memory, and Myth. My name is Mitchell Johns, and I'm a junior living in Dunster and concentrating in English.
And my name is Chris Chow, and I'm a sophomore in Cabot House, and I concentrate in history and literature and visual environmental studies. Mitch and I are members of the Harvard Art Museum Student Board, and we are both delighted to welcome you to the museum on behalf of our student community. Please now be sure to turn off your cell phones and help us warmly welcome Martha Tedeschi, the Elizabeth and John Moores Cabot Director of the Harvard Art Museums, who will now introduce tonight's program.
Thank you both. Good evening and a warm welcome to the Harvard Art Museums. You're catching us on the first day of reading period. So I think we know where the undergraduates are, except for our very dedicated friends here. But tonight we are fortunate, indeed very fortunate, to have with us our speaker and special guest, the American photographer David Levinthal. Known for his use of the Polaroid camera to make images of toys and other objects of material culture, Levinthal's expansive production over the last 30 years explores the relationship of history and myth, fantasy, fear, and desire in American popular imagery. These themes will be explored in depth in the major retrospective exhibition of his work, which opens at the Eastman Museum in Rochester in early June. Before we jump into our program, which I'm very eager to do, I want to give a few words of thanks, because I firmly believe you can never thank people too much when they're doing something good for you. Support for this lecture is provided by the Leventritt Fund, which was established through the generosity of the wife, children, and friends of the late M. Victor Leventritt, who was Harvard class of 1935. The purpose of the fund is to present outstanding thinkers about the history and theory of art to the Harvard and Greater Boston communities. In addition, contemporary art programs at the Harvard Art Museums are made possible in part by generous support by the Emily Rauh Pulitzer and Joseph Pulitzer Jr. Fund for Modern and Contemporary Art. And now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite to the podium Makeda Best, who is our Richard L. Menschel Curator of Photography here at the Harvard Art Museums, and who is a relatively new member of our staff, having joined in January of 2017, correct? Makeda.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. What does it mean to gain one's knowledge of events and of history from mass print media, television, and film? This is a question David Levinthal's photographs have asked since the 1970s, and that is no less all the more relevant today. He complicates this question further through his use of another tool of cultural socialization, toys. Levinthal was one of the few influential photographers who turned away from documenting the world through straight, unaltered photographs and turned to photographing the worlds they constructed in their studios, a historic shift that critic A.D. Coleman would identify as the directorial turn. This was understood as a rejection of realism and the belief in the direct relationship between the camera at the instant of exposure and the subject it captured. And yet, Levinthal's gesture was very much about the real and about the work of photography to record the real. His work is in direct dialogue with the images featured in magazines and newspapers that have informed our shared cultural iconography and memory. Levinthal's use of the Polaroid format to record toys and collectibles as subjects animate our conceptions of gender, race, violence, desire, nation, and history. These subjects can be seductive. The great 19th century French writer Charles Baudelaire wrote in The Lesson of Toys in 1853 that, quote, all of life can be found in miniature and far more brightly colored, glittery, and polished than in the real world. Polaroid's uniquely lush and slick images dramatize this fact, but isolated, enlarged, distorted, and decontextualized in front of Levinthal's lens, these objects also repulse, terrify, and haunt. Levinthal exhibited his first series, Hitler Moves East, in 1978. From there, his subjects have included the West, blackface memorabilia and figurines, Barbie dolls, the World Wars, urban life, Vietnam, space, Mein Kampf, and more. Though he no longer works in Polaroid, he continues to mine American history and culture in such projects as IED, or improvised explosion devices, which is on contemporary warfare. Levinthal is author of 6 books and is the recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts grant, a Polaroid Artist Support grant, and a Guggenheim Fellowship. His work is in the collections of the International Center for Photography, the Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and the Whitney Museum, and the Harvard Art Museums, among many other collections. A year ago, through an introduction made possible by a friend of the museum, Sophocles Zolas, I had the opportunity to meet David and to learn more about his practice. It is with great pleasure that I sit down with him this evening. Please join me in welcoming David Levinthal.
Makeda, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction.
Oh.
And I hope you won't mind in the future if I discreetly lift a few phrases from it. In the future, I will definitely ask your permission, but it was, I thought, very eloquent, and I'm very appreciative.
Well, it's been wonderful getting to know you over the past year, and so I feel like we have a lot to talk about. But you were here before. In 1998, you were here for a symposium that was really not necessarily in response to, but that had a great deal to do with your blackface project.
Yes.
And that was a really historic moment. I mean, it was 1998. Other panelists included Glenn Ligon and Thelma Golden, and your work had really touched a nerve. I mean, in Philadelphia, I think that the work was, and here it actually is coming up now. The museum in Philadelphia decided not to have the exhibition.
Yeah, the ICA, which ironically was probably one of the most liberal, if not radical, art institutions in the United States. I remember my good friend Gary Trudeau saying, well, you know, perhaps their fire insurance had lapsed and that's why they canceled the show. It was a sort of very interesting moment for me because it was something I'd never experienced before. And while I was acutely aware of how sensitive this subject was, it was somewhat ironic to me that, you know, just sort of prior to that, I had completed and published the Mein Kampf series. Again, a series that I was, you know, wanted to be very sensitive about how that would be perceived, and particularly among survivors. And with the blackface series, and this is, I think, true of almost all the work that I've done, these series come about very serendipitously. After the Mein Kampf work, I was asked to participate in an interview with Bill Christenberry. He would be talking about his Klan work, and I'd be talking about the Mein Kampf work. And Mary Foresta was doing this piece for C Magazine, which was a publication of the Friends of Photography. Very beautiful publication, which sadly had a short life. And Bill, who was, you know, a protege of Walker Evans, and Walker was one of my teachers when I was at Yale, it's funny because when I tell students that I studied with Walker Evans, they look at me and you're still walking around? But Bill's a great and wonderful storyteller. And Mary had the almost impossible job of keeping two people who will take a question and then just ramble on endlessly. A little bit like herding cats, and she would every once in a while say, well, can we get back to this subject that we're at hand? And somehow during our conversation, Bill and I started talking about D.W. Griffith's film, Birth of a Nation. Mm-hmm. And we were doing this at Bill's studio, and we walked over to his, essentially the home, which was connected to the studio. And our dinner that night was Chinese takeout food and some very excellent bourbon. And at one point, Bill excused himself and went upstairs and came down with a copy of the book, The Klansman, on which the film Birth of a Nation was based. And I started thinking to myself, that could be an interesting series. I've got Civil War soldiers, I've seen figurines of Confederate officers and Southern belles dancing. I could it was beginning to sort of formulate in my mind that this might be an interesting project. The one thing that I didn't have, and which I hadn't really seen, were figures that I could use of African Americans. And while I had a passing knowledge of Black memorabilia, the salt and pepper shaker, some of the cookie jars, it just so happened that several weeks later, there was this very, very large collectibles show that happened, I think, twice a year in Atlantic City, and in the old convention hall, which I think is actually where they used to hold the Miss America pageant. It was right on the boardwalk in the old days. So my girlfriend at the time lived in Philadelphia, and we drove down there. And I think, much to her, I wouldn't say chagrin, there are like 1,500 dealers from all over the world showing all kinds of collectibles. And I started looking for sort of African American figurines, which led me into sort of the world of Black memorabilia. And I very quickly realized that there was the enormity and the depth of this material. And I don't want to misquote her, but I believe years ago, Carrie Mae Weems said to me, you could essentially create your entire kitchen, if not your home, out of all the utensils you needed from Black memorabilia, which sounded like an interesting concept for her to do as an installation piece. But I was suddenly made aware of so much of this material that I hadn't really, as I say, known the depth of it. Mm-hmm. And I came home with the equivalent of like 4 grocery bags filled with objects that I'd purchased, having no idea how they would photograph, but I was just sort of fascinated, and which is often what I'll do. I'll like buy a lot of stuff and then think, maybe you should have thought about how it's going to photograph. No, I'm just going to go ahead and collect this stuff and go forward. And I remember going to the Polaroid studio. I was probably photographing something else at the time, and I brought along a few of these objects just to see how they would photograph. And this is probably a good time for me to give a little shout out to Polaroid and particularly Barbara Hitchcock, who's here tonight. Polaroid was so incredibly generous in supporting artists, and so for many years every day I worked at the Polaroid studio, I would then get a free day at the studio. So I basically used the camera for about 20 years as sort of my exclusive means of creating artwork. And when I put these objects, I used a black velvet background, which is something that I had used for some of the Desire figures, because I wanted the objects to really emanate from this sort of dark space. And the moment that I took the first picture and John Ruder, peeled it, tacked it up on the wall, I was just overwhelmed at how powerful it was. And my immediate thought was, forget Birth of a Nation. I want to learn more about these objects, and I want to make this the focus of what I want to work on. And not that long after, the curator from the ICA contacted me, and she said they'd like to do an exhibition, and she was interested in a retrospective. And I said, well, I'm already having a retrospective at ICP, but I'm really excited about this new work I'm doing, and I'd love to show it to you, and maybe we can do a show of this. And I showed her some of the work and went down to Philadelphia to meet with the director and brought some 4x5 to show to them. And they thought this was a great idea. Now, as I'm a little older and wiser in the museum world, they actually wanted to do the show within a year. I think it might have even been 9 months or something, which just never happens. There must have been some side catastrophe that occurred, that there was suddenly an opening. We need you to do this show. And so I focused, all my energy, because I was really creating an entire new series in a relatively short period of time. Mm-hmm. And I threw all my energy into that and to traveling around to some of these collectible shows. One of the largest ones is held or was held in Silver Springs, Maryland. And what was so fascinating to me about going to these shows that were specifically about black memorabilia was that most of the dealers and most of the people coming to these shows were African American. And I remember after one of these shows, there was a group of 7 or 8 of us who went out to dinner. And there was an architect from New Jersey, and she collected slave memorabilia, chains and some of the identification tags and shackles and things. And here was this group of, 5 or 6 African Americans, 3 Caucasians, and we were all talking about sort of our passion about this material. And it was kind of this amazing feeling of, it was so non-racial in a sense. There was nobody saying, well, you're Caucasian, why are you interested in this? It was all about, this is what I'm interested in, other people had other interests, and, we talked back and forth for hours. And every time I do a series, I find myself entering a different world. And so entering this world was really quite fascinating and enlightening, and I got to know a number of the dealers in this field, and when there one specific thing that I really wanted, and it's on the back cover of the blackface book, was a salt and pepper shaker of Al Jolson. And the hands, and then Al Jolson and blackface. And it's not a big object, it's like this by this. And there was this dealer / collector in Silver Springs, and we were in contact, and he called me up and he said, well, I found a set. I've got 2 heads and 1 pair of hands. One of the heads isn't in the greatest shape, but I'd be happy to sell them to you. And I said, sounds fantastic. And he was African American, and there was this wonderful sort of back and forth about, when I went down to visit him at his home, he was showing a lot of his collection to me, and it was there was kind of a wonderful openness, and when it came time, to, as I said, I was working so focused on this, I didn't really pay attention to any of the politics of what was going on at Penn and at the ICA. The curator called me up and said she wanted to bring a board member down, and to talk to me, and this woman, had a lot of concerns and issues about the subject and, how the community would respond to it. And I said, well, one of the great things about having this exhibition at a university is that it's the perfect forum for symposiums and seminars to do essentially what, Skip Gates was doing with his symposium. And I could tell that this woman was, was not terribly comfortable. And the next day, I called Judith Tannenbaum, who I think was the curator, and I said, well, how was your train ride back? I should have had a clue, because they went out to lunch after our meeting, and they asked me, oh, what's a nice place to go to lunch? And I said, oh, there's a wonderful place across the street. And they didn't invite me. And I didn't want to be invited because I had so much work to do. But clearly, there was a conversation going on that I was not going to be included in. And, Judith said, oh, she's very concerned and about the community. And sometimes my dry, sarcastic sense of humor gets the better of me. Actually, often it does. And I said, well, Judith, there's a really simple solution to that. You could just put a sign up in front of the museum that says white only. Nobody thought it was as funny as I did. I could tell she wasn't laughing at the other end. And I don't know, a month or so later, I came back from the Polaroid studio on a Friday evening, and there was a letter from the ICA. It was like, 2 short paragraphs saying that the board had decided not to support the exhibition. And, I couldn't call because it was, late Friday. So I spent the whole weekend, thinking, because this had never happened to me. I never imagined it happening. I never really got an explanation. My friend Mark Singer wrote a 1-column piece in the New Yorker about it. Mm-hmm. And the director of the museum, who I believe was Irish, responded by saying, well, we had expected the work to be more in the style of my sort of diorama type. And all I could think of was, okay, so I have Showboat with Stephen F. Foster music playing, and that would make this okay? I mean, you know, but I never got any explanation as to why. I gather there was some issues in terms of the catalog or whatever, but ironically, you know, when I talked to some artists that I knew, African-American artists in Philadelphia, they were saying, you know, we have no problem with this. This is, and the same thing happened with the Menil in Houston. I went down there prior to the show. They wanted me to come down and sort of talk to a number of the trustees, and they wanted me to meet with some of the black artists in the Houston art community. And I remember one of them saying to me, I don't know why they want you to come down and talk to us. We think your work, the work is great.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, just a few months ago, the Ferris State Museum, there's a museum at Ferris State University, the Museum of Black Memorabilia, and they got a gift, a donor gave them a gift of about 50 of your works. And Skip Gates is quoted in the press release and saying, you know, how important it is to view these works. So it's interesting how this conversation has continued even over the past 20 years.
Well, you know, it's also interesting. I remember at Skip's symposium, I met the painter Michael Ray Charles, and he and I became, you know, friendly. And what was interesting is that at the time, Michael was being attacked by other African-American artists because he was using the sort of minstrel show posters as the theme of his work. And Michael is, first of all, he's a wonderful painter. He's also a former basketball player in college and quite tall. And his wife is quite short. And we were on one of these panels together, and Michael was getting a lot of criticism, and his wife stood up and started talking, and he's going, it's okay, I can take care of this. But I remember he and his wife and I were having breakfast one morning during the symposium, and, you know, Michael was talking to me about why, you know, my work was raising a lot of questions, as was his work. And he put his hand on my shoulder, and I think Michael was about 6'4", 6'5", and he said, anybody gives you a problem, you just have them call me. And I said, thank you very much, Michael.
So let's go, we'll go back a little bit and tell us about your time at Yale. I mean, you started off as a straight photographer making images of the ocean and whatnot, and then there was this moment where you changed.
Yeah, I mean, I was taking, you know, California landscape photographs with a 35 millimeter Nikon camera that belonged to my father. And, you know, going down to places like Oceania and photographing the sand dunes, or, you know, yeah, Pescadero, and down to Point Lobos, and, you know, reading the day books of Edward Weston. And it was funny because I was, you know, an undergraduate at Stanford, and I think very fortuitously, at the time, Stanford didn't have any photography classes. But there was something called, you have to remember, this is like 1966 in the Bay Area, something called the Free University. And at the Free University, anyone could teach a course about anything. And it had no real connection to Stanford other than there was like this small, tiny office building. It was like an Adobe shack that the Free University could use as a kind of an office. And my sister, who's younger than I am, had spent the previous summer making some films with this filmmaker. Well, he was actually a graduate student in biology named Dwight Johnson. And they were for the School of Education. And my sister's role, which my father felt was sort of typecasting, was to play a disruptive high school student, which she did very well. But Dwight was like the coolest person I'd ever met. You know, he had long hair. Everywhere he went, he was surrounded by beautiful women. In spite of the fact that he was married to the older sister of one of my best friends from high school. And so I thought, he's cool. I want to be cool. I'm going to take his photo class. And now, unbeknownst to me, there was a class offered, again, using class in the loosest possible sense, at the Free University called Tantric Yoga and LSD. Had I had any idea as a 17-year-old coming out of high school what those words meant, I believe my life would have taken, not only would it be over by this point, but it would have taken a very different trajectory. So this sort of photo class consisted of, 10 or 12 graduate students who had all done photography at some point, but they were now, pursuing advanced degrees. We met at someone's house, and the second and I believe last meeting of the class was at Dwight and Janet's house, and he showed me how to make a print and how to develop black and white film. And that was sort of the moment when I discovered photography and kind of fell in love with it. And one of the great things about there not being any formal classes was that everything I wanted to do, I had to make happen for myself. There was a very well-known photographer, Ruth Bernard, who was in that same generation as Weston and Ansel Adams. And Ruth had something called the Ruth Bernhard School of Photography, which took place at Ruth's house on Green Street in San Francisco. And I took a class there on printing from Roger Minnick, who ran the photo labs at UC Berkeley and produced a book called Delta West. He's done other books since then, but just a magnificent printer. Mm-hmm. And it was like, okay, I'm doing all the things that Roger taught me, doing this, and then I flip over my print, and it doesn't look anything like the gorgeous prints that he's making. But, and then I took a class from Ruth herself on photographing the nude, which the class was like 4 men in their late 30s and 40s who looked like they were car salesmen, and myself, who was an undergraduate. I always got the feeling that they were enjoying looking at the young nude models. And I actually still have the negatives from those classes with Ruth. And many years later, when I had the Desire show at the Friends of Photography in San Francisco, I sent Ruth the catalog and a little note saying, you probably don't remember me, but I really think taking that class with you influenced this work that I'm currently showing. And, at that point, she was in her early 90s, I believe, but she sent me back this lovely letter, and she did remember me because, again, this is the 60s. There was one class that I missed because I was sick, and the only contact number she had for me was my parents' number, because kids didn't have phones in college. So she called and my mother answered, and my mother said she had a lovely 20-minute chat with Ruth, and Ruth wanted to know that, she hoped I was feeling better and that she would see me next week. So I do feel I benefited a lot from having to forge out my own studies in photography. And at one point, I think when I was a junior, I thought about the idea of maybe I should go to art school. And I took a trip back east and went to Chicago, where I met with Aaron Siskind, who was at IIT, and I forget the woman who was teaching at the School of the Art Institute. I met with Harry Callahan at RISD. And I have to say, Harry Callahan was so nice and so generous, because here is this, I was probably 18 or 19 years old, student showing him landscape photographs from California taken with a 35 millimeter camera. And we probably spent an hour and a half or 2 hours just sort of talking. And his one comment to me, which was, I now get it was not only sweet, but he said, perhaps I might want to think about using a slightly larger format if I was going to be doing landscapes. And I ended up buying an old twin lens Rolly. But to this day, when I get a call from a student and they say, I'd like to show you my work, I always say yes, because I feel that's what he did for me. And, back then photography was really almost like a club. And the fact that when I wanted to see these people, I literally just called, my father said, well, come to my office and just call these people. And, I called Aaron Siskind. Aaron answers the phone. Sure, you're going to come to Chicago and we'll, set up a time and get together. So that, I think, that generosity of spirit is something that I feel very committed to continuing. And, in those days, when I was going to graduate school at Yale, there were only two options. You either taught or you did commercial photography. The only person selling work on a regular basis was Ansel Adams. And for everybody else, it was like a little bit of a supplement.
Did you call Walker Evans?
No, I wanted to go to Yale because he was teaching there, but it was in the graduate program. He wasn't, I'm not even sure if he was teaching there then, because he came, I think, in the very late 60s, early 70s. John Hill, who ran the program was actually a subdivision of the graphic design program, which had a great international reputation. And in fact, when I got accepted to Yale, I'd applied as a senior in college and was put on the waiting list and didn't get in, but I was applying to the graphic design program, which was a 3-year program. When I was accepted in 1971, I got this letter saying, you've been accepted into the photography program. And I was like, what photography program are you talking? But it turned out they had decided that they would make it sort of a sub-program. And there were 4 students in my class. Jerry Thompson, who ended up printing for Walker and really taking care of him and writing about him, was one of my classmates. So it was, but again, it was a wonderful situation because we were thrust in with the graphic design students, even though photography was considered the kindergarten. We had one big table with the 4 photographers. All the graphic designers had their big drafting tables. And, it was like, the graphic design program was the serious program, and we were sort of playing around a little bit, and every once in a while we show something. But being with these people 12 hours a day, it was a great, not only camaraderie, but just, the ideas flowing back and forth. There were only, I think, 11 or 12 graphic design students. And again, very fortuitously, one of them happened to be Gary Trudeau, which is, where we met. And eventually, it was out of that relationship that Hitler Moves East was born, through what Gary and I both felt was the absolute foolishness of his publisher, who saw Gary's work. Gary's thesis project was creating a faux biography of a German Luftwaffe pilot using only graphic symbols and photographs and no text. And at the time, I was doing my, very early toy soldier photographs. And his publishers, Jim Andrews and John McNeil, saw some of my work, saw Gary's work, and said to two 24-year-olds, "Why don't you guys do a book together?" And we were like, "Yeah, sure, why not?" We got an advance of $1,500 that we split. And I remember Gary handing me my check for $750 and saying, "Just remember, if you cash this check, we really have to make this book." Our contract was to deliver it within a year. It took us 3.5 years, but for a lot of reasons. One, Gary received a Pulitzer for Doonesbury and Watergate and everything. But it, again, was very fortunate because my work was evolving so much from the point when, I'd been photographing on the floor. I started adding more things. And almost all the photographs in the book were done probably in a 6-month period at the very end of that process. So that having that time to let the work evolve was really very, very critical.
And what was it in your mind as you were creating that series? Were you thinking about photographs and films and movies, and how did you construct it?
I was looking at a lot of documentary photography, and actually, I should give credit to one of the used bookstores here in Harvard Square. I was up, visiting and I was walking around. They always have, all these paperbacks out in these bins, and I saw this book, Hitler Moves East, by this German writer, Paul Carell, whose writing style was very similar to that of Cornelius Ryan, who wrote The Longest Day. It read like a novel, but it was all factually accurate and based. And I picked it up, and I'd always enjoyed reading history. And in fact, when I was in, junior high, I think, I joined the history book club because they were offering as a membership gift the 2-volume West Point Atlas of Military History that I always used to go over to the Menlo Park Library and look at for hours. And I thought, oh, this would be great. And you only had to buy like 1 or 2 books a year. Interestingly, one of the books I bought was by an English writer, Alan Clark, called Barbarossa, which was about the German invasion of Russia in 1941. So I'm sitting back in New Haven, and I'm reading Hitler Moves East, and I'm looking at some photographs in that book and looking at other source material. And for my thesis project, I momentarily thought about taking titles from that book, like, say, Tank Battle at Smolensk. And I don't know why, but at a certain point I thought, the work's not ready for that. And when Gary and I decided, we accepted the idea of a book project, having absolutely no clue what we were going to do. And Gary saw the book, Hitler Movies, and said, yeah, let's we should do the Eastern Front. And one of the great advantages of that was that in the early 70s, there were very, very few photographs of the Eastern Front other than those taken by the Germans. The Russians hadn't opened up their archives at all. And right around the time that the book came out, Burt Lancaster narrated a documentary series on public television. It was done in cooperation with the BBC, and it was called The Unknown War, which was about the Eastern Front, because it really was unknown. I mean, we knew about it, you would read about it in history, but the enormity of it was just not that well understood. And I know when the book came out in the late 70s, people would ask, well, why didn't you do Normandy and D-Day?
Yeah.
And I said, because everybody has hundreds of images in their mind from that, from old Life magazines, from John Wayne movies, from, there's like a built-in image bank. Mm-hmm. And the same is true for the war in the Pacific. Mm-hmm. So dealing with the Eastern Front, it was as if Gary and I had a blank canvas to work on. Obviously, things have changed. Mm-hmm. The archives in Russia have been opened. There's a lot more visual material. Mm-hmm. But it gave us a tremendous visual freedom. Mm-hmm. That was, I think, very, very helpful.
So you've covered many topics in your work, and how do you move on from series to series? How do you prepare for that? I mean, you just spoke about understanding that not a lot of viewers knew this particular historical moment. Is that what you think about as you move on into other series? What viewers might know, what they think they know? How do you kind of go about what was your process?
Well, I'll answer that question, but sort of from the other end initially. I sort of know when a series is over. Mm-hmm. And this was true of Blackface, and it's been sort of true of every series that I've done. There's a point at which I have more things that I could photograph, but I feel like I've reached the point where I've said in the photographs really all that I feel I have to say. Mm. And I kind of felt that when I took the photograph of the Al Jolson salt and pepper shaker. Mm-hmm. It was like, I put the cookie jar on the front that was based on the figure from the Coon Chicken Inn. And, Al Jolson was on the back, and that sort of captured for me in a way the series. And I did have the opportunity, it's the only time I've ever traveled with the Polaroid 2024 camera, which Barbara will tell you is about the size of a refrigerator. I should say a poorly maintained refrigerator with parts coming off that John Ruder is holding together with a vice grip. But I took the Polaroid camera to the Menil because I was invited by the director at the time. The Menil had a very substantial collection of black memorabilia that one of Mrs. de Menil's daughters had acquired or convinced her mother to acquire. And it was from a collector in Kokomo, Indiana. So it was referred to at the Menil as the Kokomo collection, and it included a lot of things, not just objects, but sheet music and all kinds of things. And they had never displayed the material. And I'd gotten to know the director through some mutual friends in Santa Fe. And he said, why don't you come and visit and I'll show you this stuff. And it literally was in the equivalent of a garage. He opened it up and he was showing me all these things. And I actually was pleased that a number of objects that we had in common in our collections, I felt mine were in much better condition. But they had amazing folk art pieces. Mm-hmm. So John and I brought the camera down there for a week, and I think we photographed, I don't know, close to 50 different pieces. And the Menil is such a wonderful museum. One of the pieces that the director wanted me to look at was this cigar store figure from Missouri that was probably about 5.5 feet tall, and had a whole history behind it. Apparently, the legend has it that there were bullet holes in it from Jesse James, and there was a whole story when it was acquired by the Menil and left this town, and but it was on display in an exhibition, and he said, I really want you to look at this, and I said, it's beautiful, and he said, would you like to photograph it? And we were photographing down in the basement, and I said, but you have it on display. He said, no, I'll have them, take it down to where you're shooting at night. You can shoot it first thing in the morning, and then they'll bring it back upstairs and put it back on display, which I thought was incredibly generous of him. But, it was a unique image. And I think I probably took 5 or 6 different photographs of it, because some of it in full figure, some of them in close-up, but, it was a piece from the early 1800s that of this young African-American boy with a cigar and, his coveralls, but it had all obviously been, carved by hand, and was just such an amazing piece. And so the images from the Menil, particularly the folk art objects, were things that I never would have had access to otherwise. And I think they had a very, it was a wonderful perspective to be able to add to that series. And, to sort of answer your question, it's, I'm always looking at things, and sometimes I'll find something that just I feel is so unusual and so unique, and I'll get it, but I may not use it for years. And you and I were talking about the diorama that I purchased in Paris in the 80s. It can be a period of almost 20 years. This was a diorama of a Klan lynching that was a folk art piece that was using some existing figurines, but they had built a barn. There was a black man, hanging from the barn. There were some Klan figures on horseback, but it clearly was, a piece that a unique piece. And I saw it in Paris at this little store that sold military memorabilia and toy soldiers. And fortunately, I would go to Paris every year for Paris Photo, and I was a extremely good client of this store, shall we say. I would always come back with a suitcase full of stuff. So I was able to convince them that I wanted to buy it, and could they send it to me in New York. And the piece was probably about this high, maybe half the size of this table was the base, and they finally acquiesced and, packed it up and sent it to me. And literally for so many years, it just sat in my studio. And I'm very grateful that during one of our visits, I was at least able to show you some of the images from it, because I found them so powerful. But I feel they're really appropriate for what I'm now calling history, which allows me to go anywhere and do anything.
Your newest series.
I don't think it would have been an appropriate image for the blackface series, because that was so much about transforming those specific objects. And this was really a diorama of a historical moment. I know you asked me early on, and I did not answer your question as to how I went from a landscape photographer to photographing toys. So I will try and do that. I will say succinctly, but I'm not sure that that's possible. My second year at Yale, I've been doing sort of Lee Friedlander, Dwayne Michaels photographs, just street photography. I've been photographing, out of my car window. And at one point I was photographing, I was living outside of New Haven. I was photographing animals that had been run over, including one of a skunk that was right on that sort of white dividing strip. So my classmates would call me sometimes and say, "Oh, there's a dead animal on such and such a road." I'd go over there and, take a picture. My second year at Yale, I really felt like, my parents were paying my tuition. I should really try and learn something while I was there. And the one thing I hated doing in photography was working in the studio. If I ever had, like when I spent a summer at Rochester at RIT, when we had a studio assignment, I would do like one photograph. Okay, I'm done, So I decided my thesis project should be a studio project. And this was probably in like mid-November. And the department stores were, having their Christmas displays out with toys. And I was walking through one of the local department stores and I saw a metal Marx dollhouse. And I remembered those from my youth. I got a gas station, my sister would get the dollhouse.
Very popular toy company.
And I thought, okay, I'll put together this tin litho dollhouse, and each room will be a separate photograph, and that will comprise my thesis project. Sometimes I'm just not the brightest guy in the world. Photographing lithograph tin with a studio light is extremely complex, as I've learned over the years. But at the time, I was quite naive, and I thought, this is never going to work. So I went back to the department store, and I saw some bags of cowboys and Indians, and like a little, plastic Fort Apache. But I also saw these 2 boxes of toy soldiers that were much more sophisticated, and they were from a company, Britons, who used to make lead soldiers that I had as a child, and they were like collectible type things, and you'd get a little box with 6 Coldstrom guards in it or something. And I did, the typical graduate student thing. I had them gift wrapped. I took them back to the art department, or the photo studio. I photographed them wrapped, sort of tearing the wrapping, taking the box out, putting the soldiers out. But the moment I got those soldiers out, the Briton soldiers, they were British infantry and I think some German infantry from World War II. And with really no background. I think there was like a little plastic tree that came with it. The moment I started photographing, those figures, it just brought me back to my childhood of playing with figures like that. And I got very excited and enthusiastic. And to give full credit where credit is due, you know, the wonderful thing about Ivy League schools is you have a very long winter break. Mm-hmm. So I was meeting my family to go skiing in Aspen. And my youngest brother, who generally wouldn't ski the whole day, you know, he'd go out and have hot chocolate at some point with my mother. And you have to remember, Aspen was a really small town back then. It was like your ski instructor was probably going to be your waiter at the Red Onion that night. I mean, it was a ski town. But in that ski town was a toy store that Dan discovered, probably a precursor to the fact that he eventually went on to become a Harvard undergraduate, whereas I'm not as bright. I ended up at Stanford. He found these box sets that were, for those of you who are sort of my generation, often in the back of comic books, there'd be this one-page ad for Civil War soldiers and this beautiful, colorful illustration of Confederate and Union soldiers fighting. And you'd send $1.25 to Battle Creek, Michigan, and back would come this little box with gray and blue figures that bore no resemblance to what you saw in the photograph. But you'd still send away, you know, the next month for Roman legions or something. So Dan found these HO scale, which is like, the figures are maybe less than an inch tall. These sets of World War II figures produced by a British company. And the box art was amazing, but you'd open it up and there'd be like a box of German soldiers, a box of British soldiers, you know, 2 plastic tanks and some background material. So I bought a couple of those, put them in my suitcase, took them back to California, started setting them up literally on the linoleum floor in my room, borrowing Dan's wooden block city. And slowly, there happened to be a big hobby store in Mountain View. And I would go there and they had more of these sets. And I started buying like telephone poles and trees. But still, it was very, very obviously toy-like. And, you know, when a soldier was dead, you know, I'd knock him over. The one image that I took that I think sort of redirected me was, they had a set that was a pontoon bridge and there was a tank coming over it. And I was using a single lens Rolly camera that had built-in bellows, so I could get fairly close because these objects were so small. I mean, I was literally on the floor photographing. And I focused on the tip of the tank's gun. And because I was so close, you know, there was a very, very narrow depth of field. So everything behind that point got softer and softer. Mm-hmm. And it did 2 things. It made the object seem much more real, and it also gave it a sense of motion. And essentially, I've continued utilizing that style, you know, ever since then. Mm-hmm. But that was a real sort of turning point, and I spent the rest of the vacation. I was also printing on Codalith paper, which was this sort of oddball sepia. It wasn't meant to be sepia, mm-hmm. but a photographer, Barbara probably can answer this question better than I can. I always think of Les Krems as the first photographer who was really utilizing this material. Mm-hmm. And I discovered it that summer I was at RIT, and I was doing everything on Codalith. My street photography, you know, my portfolio for applying to Yale was all on Codalith. And very few people had seen it because it just wasn't out there a lot. Mm-hmm. But the sepia tonality added sort of almost a historical veneer to the work. So when I came back to Yale, we had our thesis critique, or progress, I guess you'd call it. And all of my classmates they were very, very into, the 8x10 Deerdorf, just like Edward Weston, the Beers developer, the perfect print. I remember my friend Jerry Thompson, had his prints were like ready to be put up on a museum wall. Mm-hmm. So I come in for my turn, and I have like 6 or 7 boxes, each with about 100 Codolith prints. And I just started handing them around to the various faculty members. And very fortuitously, Linda Connor, who was teaching at the San Francisco Art Institute, was there as a visiting artist. There was dead silence in the room, except for Linda, who was like, "Oh, these are incredible." And it wasn't negative on the part of the other faculty members. Mm-hmm. Nobody had ever seen anything like it. I think I remember Norman Ives, who's, famous graphic designer. Norman's suggestion to me afterwards was that I should look at the work of Hans Bellmer. Mm-hmm. And I looked at Hans Bellmer's work and I go, what the hell does this have to do with what I'm doing? I don't get it, but Linda was so enthusiastic. And I always tell students, if you've taken physics in high school, you put a hockey puck on dry ice, you give it just a tiny push and it just keeps gliding. Mm-hmm. And Linda was that tiny push. Mm-hmm. That was all I heard was her enthusiasm. Mm-hmm. And, we've remained friends for many, many years. And several years ago, we did a conversation similar to this at the San Jose Museum. So even though I had privately thanked her so much for that moment, I had a chance to publicly thank her because it really made a huge difference. I mean, that was the voice that I was hearing was, there's somebody who thinks this is really cool. Mm-hmm. And that kept me going for years. Mm-hmm. But that's how I got started with toys. And, I think having the opportunity to do the book with Gary was also so important because the last place I taught was the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And I was still, I was doing other things. I was, trying to finish the book and I was doing the toys, but I was photographing in and around Las Vegas because Las Vegas in 1975 was just like Martin Scorsese's movie Casino. It was pretty fascinating, and I did some other work with little strips of what were then considered porn films, but would now be considered MTV videos, where I cut them into little strips and put them in slide holders, printed positives, and then sort of colored the pieces. And Dwayne Michaels was visiting. He came as a visiting artist, and I had my faculty show up, and he and I, it was in essentially an abandoned classroom, and I had the Hitler Moves East, and I had some of these other things that I were doing, and he and I walked around, just the two of us, and he was going, well, that's interesting. And when he got to the Hitler Moves East, he said, I've never seen anything like this. Which was very heartwarming. And so, the book gave me the opportunity to really focus on the toys for an extended period of time. And when it came out, and then, a year or so later, the work was exhibited at, it was then called George Eastman House. But, I've often wondered, had those things not happened, where would I have gone off to? Probably not the same place if I had taken the LSD and tantric yoga class, but equally fortuitous in many ways that was skipped over.
I think we should take some questions, actually.
I'd be happy to.
Just flying by.
I have to admit that if you ask me a question, we may be here tomorrow and I'll still be answering it.
We're going to wait till the...
Oh.
Thanks. Could you comment on what you think you were trying to say photographically in Hitler Moves East and compare that with the work, which I'm less familiar with, but IED, and how you look back on what you were trying to do back with Hitler Moves East?
Yeah, I think, that's an interesting question because I think, Gary and I were so immersed in, just sort of creating this book. Obviously, he had a sideline business that was doing quite well called Doonesbury. So I was, it was really up to me to keep making these photographs. And it really became, for me at that time, the best that I can recall. You can consult my journals, which are now at the Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian. That's a whole nother story. But my best recollection of that was that a lot of it for me was problem solving. I had read enough. I'd read a lot of history. I was looking at a lot of photographs from the Eastern Front. As I said, pretty much all German photographs. And interestingly, mostly published in book form for model makers so that they would get an idea of, what the correct camouflage and the correct colors were. Hitler, I remember going to the hobby store in Mountain View at one point, and the guy at the cash register said, "You're the guy who did Hitler Moves East." So I was popular in the hobby world. But I had things like, how do I make snow? How am I going to how do I create the Russian steppes? And I tried, I thought, well, maybe paint bristles or, nothing seemed to work. One day I was walking through, I don't know if they had Caldors up in Massachusetts, but it was like a big kind of Montgomery Ward's type store in Connecticut. I was walking through there. In order to get to the parking lot, you had to go through the gardening section. And I saw something called grass filler seed. And I suddenly thought, grass filler seed. I have this 4x8 foot table that I had divided into different areas. So I got some potting soil and, this grass filler seed. My friends thought I was all totally crazy, which there was probably some truth to that. Spread this stuff, would water it, and it grew. And it actually grew so well that I remember I was going away for something and a friend of mine wanted to stay at my place because he was working on his dissertation. And I said, "Bob, I'm happy to have you stay there, but once every 3 days you have to take the scissors and just cut the grass because it'll turn from the Russian steppes into the African savanna." And because it was indoors, it was sort of pale. And I'm photographing in black and white, but in printing on the Kodalith, it photographed perfectly. I mean, it was amazing. I think the photograph that was up of the explosion scene was one day Gary came over to help with the photography, and we were two young kids. We had, I think, 2 family-sized bottles of Coke, a box of Hostess powdered sugar donuts, various and sundry other health foods they were munching on. And New Haven being, there were a lot of theater in the city. I'd gotten some explosion powder at one of the theatrical supply stores. So we put some soldiers on the hill, and Gary had this brilliant idea. He took a pin, he stuck it in this one soldier, and so he became sort of suspended because the pin just blended in with the grass. I'm giving away all these great secrets to this photograph. So I put a little down, and we lit it with a cotton ball, and it went sort of poof. And Gary said, "Here, give me that." And he started sprinkling it like an 8-year-old would sprinkle salt on French fries at a bowling alley. And we lit it, and there was this explosion. It was like a shotgun going off. The cotton ball bounced against the window, hit the floor. The negative is almost opaque, but it was a great photograph, and Gary said, "God, if I'd known you were having so much fun over here, I would have
come and help Walt.
Come more often." We also, not that all of our experiments were successful. Gary was very into my burning as many plastic buildings as possible. I had like this whole little city thing set up, and I had this tiny little plastic airplane, and we made 2 little loops on the cockpit, and I we had some like string going down, and Gary said, "Okay, I'm gonna light the plane on fire, and then you can shoot it as it goes down the string," which was conceptually a good idea. However, halfway down the string is on fire, and the plane just drops straight down. But we did get a good photograph out of it, of that sort of preliminary movement. So for me, it really was, how do I solve these problems? I don't think I was looking at it in any sort of more theoretical way. I do remember Gary and I on the train, we're going to New York to meet with the publisher, and Gary's reading his preface to me on the train, and it's beautiful. I mean, Gary's a wonderful writer. It was so eloquent. And he turns to me and he goes, "That is what we were trying to do, wasn't it?" And I said, "I don't know, but it sounds really good. So let's just stick with that." I feel, it's funny. I think the work for that book was done as the Vietnam War was winding down. And the Vietnam War, for anyone who went to college, in the 60s, was something that was an enormous influence on your life. You had the lottery, the draft lottery, and all these things. So I'm sure that influenced us in a way. We used a lot of, as much as possible, first-person material, which I had access to from the Hoover Institute at Stanford, because my father was on the faculty and I was a graduate. I found this one diary from a German soldier, Benno Zenzer, that fortuitously had been translated from German into English because neither Gary or I could read or speak German. And he was an infantry soldier who was at Stalingrad and was killed. And reading his diary, this sense of nihilism. Here's someone, he knows he's going to die. He knows he's never leaving this place. His diary was amazing. And we lifted a lot of quotes from him. We lifted a lot of quotes that I found from, various, German officers. There were some Russian officers that we were able to quote. And at Stanford had a government documents library. After the end of World War II, the Defense Department did very, very extensive interviews with German officers who had fought on the Eastern Front. Because the Cold War, I mean, they did these, pretty much right after the war, because the idea that the United States and Russia would at some point possibly have a military conflict. So there were all these incredible documents available that had been written up. They synthesized these interviews and talking about, fighting in the Russian winter and, all these things. So there was a lot of great material that I was able to get at Stanford that we then pulled quotes from and put into the book. And while it was never our intention to have this book be, quote, an anti-war book, when I look back on it and I read the text, I mean, they were, the casualties on the Eastern Front were over 30 million. I mean, the numbers are so incomprehensible when compared to, say, the war in Western Europe. I forget the percentage of the Russian population that was killed, but it was, it was in double digits. I mean, it was huge. I feel when I read the book or look at the book now and read those quotes, there's a feeling, there is a kind of anti-war feeling, but it wasn't made obvious, which I think would have restricted its timelessness, because it's still a book that, people look at and reference, and, obviously more in an art context, but I feel the fact that we weren't trying to do something like that added to its longevity. IED, Gary was doing a lot of strips about the war in Iraq, and I was trolling the internet, not looking at porn, and I came across this toy company that was producing, this is as the war is being fought, producing figures, American troops, Iraqi soldiers, Iraqi civilians at checkpoints. I mean, it was an amazing array of things. And as the equipment changed, like when they went from the Humvees to the more sophisticated armored personnel characters, that toy was coming out, almost instantaneously. So I shared this website with Gary, who emailed me back and said, "Thanks, I've now just completed all of my Christmas shopping." And what intrigued me about these figures was the contemporaneous nature of them. When we were doing World War II, when I look back on it, there wasn't the greatest separation, but it was at least 25, almost maybe 30 years. Well, 25 years. Here it was instantaneous.
Right.
And my initial idea was I started photographing with my same Rauh camera. I was shooting color transparency film. And I had lunch with Gary and I was showing him some of the stuff. And he said, "David, these are beautiful. But if you're going to photograph this war, you have to shoot it digitally, because that's how it's being seen." And he was absolutely right. I mean, I've known Gary for so long. His intuition is so good that I immediately went out and bought a used Hasselblad. And, it was a little bit like going back to school. I had experimented with digital years before, but it was like, I don't want to have to relearn stuff. And, I was working with Polaroid, and, Polaroid was my opioid addiction at the time. But suddenly I actually had a project. So it made me kind of overcome that. And I utilize 0.1% of the capabilities of the Hasselblad. But it does what I want to do, and so I'm happy with that. And in many ways, it's like Polaroid because I immediately see the image on the display. However, unlike Polaroid, each shot does now not cost me $250. It started out at $25 when I started working in the early 80s, so I don't blame Barbara for that. But, you know, and it also allowed me to think outside of the vertical format of the 2024. My friend Bill Wegman and I, we were having lunch once, and Bill said, you know, at a certain point, I just see things vertically. Mm-hmm. You know, he's done some diptychs and triptychs and things, but, you know, that's how your mind is looking. And with digital, I could expand that. I could do a Custer's Last Stand. I could do all kinds of things, and I could make prints in all different sizes. So it was, I know I haven't answered your question.
I don't know if we've got.
But I think there was a lot of similarity. There was a lot of problem solving, like how do I do night vision? Mm-hmm. Put green saran wrap over flashlights and have my young son go like this off to the side. So,
Not sure, we might have, I think we're timed, but thank you so much, David. This has been wonderful.
Oh, well,
to
thank
talk
you
to
all so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.